Green Street Hooligans is a great film about soccer. I mean, football. Sorry. I've never been a sports girl, but once I started to watch Green Street Hooligans, which is a movie that's been on my bucket list for a while, I think it's become one of my favorites. This film gets into the nitty-gritty about the 2000s British football hooliganism culture, which only recently has football culture there only become safe for the general public in London. And well, I think there's no better film to talk about the history of football hooliganism throughout cinema more than Green Street Hooligans themselves. If you haven't watched this film, Green Street Hooligans is a 2005 British-American film about football hooliganism. We focus on the West Ham stadiums, and from the surface, it seems like a film just about gang violence. I mean, it's basically blokes fighting other blokes over football. But, as you'll see, this film talks about a very British working-class subculture that packages it for international audiences like me and you. But what I really want to dive into is the bigger picture of Green Street Hooligans and what it represents for this era of British cinema. Visually, we're starting off pretty bleak. Green Street Hooligans is an aggressively unglamorous film. It's full of washed-out colors and handheld cameras. I guess you could say it's very real. As I mentioned, it's not glamorous, and we're looking at London through whatever the opposite of rose-colored glasses could be. You know what I mean. It's raw and authentic, it's nitty-gritty, it's grimy, it's sticky, it looks gross, and it is meant to be gross. This matters because there's a long tradition in British cinema of what's called social realism. We're talking kitchen sink dramas from the 1960s, films like A Taste of Honey or The Sporting Life. Movies that capture the working class life without the Hollywood polish and what lies on the underbelly of these regular people. If we jump further into the 90s and 2000s, we have films like Trainspotting and The Football Factory, two popular films that are meant to be unfiltered and unappealing. Of course, it's appealing to us, an unfamiliar audience. You could say it's our American eye. This kind of leads me where I'm getting at when I'm talking about Green Street Hooligans. There's a fiscal prudence shown through the film that isn't the means of Lexi Alexander's low budget, but rather a selling point. This film wasn't made for the British audience, rather the non-Brits. It's a selling point that makes the film so dangerous, so exciting, so raw and authentic in a way that entices unfamiliar audiences about this hooliganism culture. As the GSC says, we, the Yanks, want to consume British working-class masculinity from a safe distance. We know where home isn't, but we're happily willing to watch from afar. 2005 was a big and strange time for British cinema. I mean, the old buzz of the late 90s Britpop-fueled cool Britannica moment had fizzled out, leaving many directors in a sort of limbo. Economically, at least, as during this time there was a big crackdown on government taxing which led to some silly little transactions between the UK and the US with some handsomely paid actors. And well, it wasn't to say this limbo was unsuccessful because of that. We've got treasures like the Full Monty and Lock, Stock, and the Two Smoking Barrels, who had found fairly friendly success internationally, which I would assume many directors were like, maybe monetizing on our toxic masculinity culture could be a good thing. I'm actually not kidding. I mean, it's true. As we can see, at the time, you could say that the selling point of the bleak British working class life was something new, something fresh for Hollywood, and it was funding British cinema, so it was a sort of win-win.
Damn, what is that, bro?
Let's talk about Green Street Hooligans as a character, though. We start with Mac Buckner, a Harvard journalism student as Elijah Woods, and it's like, wow, Frodo has really gone off the deep end. Throughout the film, we watch him get expelled from Harvard and get looped within the world of the Green Street elites when he visits his sister in London. His figure throughout the film is a technique in and of itself. He is the cultural translator, someone you, as the audience, can project yourself into. His purpose is to translate the British working class culture into something we can understand, like we're learning with him. We follow Matt throughout this film, interacting with Pete and the rest of the GSC, slowly integrating himself within the community, and it's like, oh wow, am I a part of this too?
Every football team in Europe's got a film. Some have two. Christ, I forgot how clueless you Yanks are.
But there's more of a historical importance to this film. It's one of the many great films within this new wave cycle of British hooligan films between 2004 to 2007. For example, The Football Factory, Rise of the Foot Soldier, and The Firm remake. All these films presented sports hooliganism in its raw and authentic self, but only Green Street Hooligans broke the barriers internationally, gaining a cult following in the States. Why to be exact? Because of this cultural translator character Matt represents. The American audience can relate to an Americanized character figuring out this new gang culture, and that's why it grabbed the attention of so many. I think the rise of the cultural translator in film history is exceptional not only for British cinema, as a whole, for cinema. We have great films within this mid-2000s era with a cultural translator figure like Lost in Translation and Spanglish. These are two films that also had admirable success in the box office, but let's narrow it back down to British film. We clearly love The Football Factory here, being released in 2004. It's very similar to Green Street Hooligans, the violence of British sports hooliganism, but it's 100% British. There's nothing wrong with the British, but when we compare and contrast, The Football Factory only garnered 1.1 million at the UK box office without much of an international audience. Green Street Hooligans, on the other hand, with its cultural translator, made 5.2 million worldwide and became a cult classic. Matt's arc throughout the film is one of the token soft American who becomes a hardened man. This arc isn't only narrative, but it's industrial too. The film does not glorify gang violence and hooliganism in any way, and it shows it for what it is, honest and violent. It teaches the American audience how to consume this portrayal of British working class underbelly, basically telling us that we can be an outsider like Matt and still access the world that is not ours, a home that we know is not ours, but we can still understand it and be changed by it. But we need to talk about why this subculture existed in the first place, because football hooliganism wasn't just about loving your team too much. It was the result of something much bigger. During the 1970s through the 1990s, there was a culture known as hooliganism culture, which is a sort of direct result of the collapsing British industry under Thatcher. This is why films within this era of the 2000s was called post-Thatcher. What did this mean? Tons of mines closed, factories condemned, and the entire working class community was essentially left for the birds. Their identity, their class, and everything that was built around the pride of being a working class man was suddenly gone. No jobs, no dirt and grime, and no way to follow the traditional means of being a man. And this is where football firms found their rise. Football has always been a safe space for the younger working class men to reclaim their brotherhood and reclaim their power. If you weren't skilled at handiwork, you could compensate for being a top man of your firm. If you were no good in the practical world, you could be good in the world of violence and loyalty. This could be considered a start of the fandom culture. I mean, these men at the time were diehard fans of their teams. Literally, living on the edge was the culture. It's important to note that Green Street Hooligans was released in 2005, well past the golden age for hooliganism. With guarded all-seater stadiums, CCTV, and capital punishment for causing commotion, sports hooliganism was essentially a dead culture. And because hooliganism was a dead culture, that made it safe to consume. This film is a representation of the 1980s, shown through the lens of what working-class culture was within the sports scene of Britain. This film doesn't just depict the subculture at the time, but how it's processed by the film through insecurities and masculinity complexes. The class, identity, and culture of post-industrial Britain.
What? You fucking journal!
Now, hooliganism isn't hooliganism without a few punches or two. And Green Street shows these ideological tensions, which all connects to a much larger debate in film history about whether you can critique violence while also making it entertaining. For their case, heavy criticism on the issues of glorifying violence and its mixed messages on brotherhood versus brutalism is what gained them a more niche audience status. Green Street Hooligans makes a comfy fit within this status, but with the more time-relevant playbook of the 2000s masculinity in crisis charms other films like Fight Club and Chopper have. These films represents their violence with rose-tinted glasses, like, oh, this is so badass. And while don't get me wrong, the idea of being someone with so much social influence over sports culture also seems badass, being soccer punched right in the face doesn't seem as glamorous in Green Street as how Fight Club makes it seem so pretty.
Motherfucker!
This isn't to say that Green Street Hooligans isn't in any way cinematically appealing too. If we compare historical footage of how real British hooliganism was back in the 80s with our film, it's ugly, panicked, and bloody. Football violence was true violence at the time, and we can see a glimpse of that throughout the film's direction. Now, Green Street has some charm, with Matt growing up as a fighter and no longer the man he was when he'd gotten jumped by the Birmingham firm in the beginning of the film. But the film still follows Hollywood grammar, dressing the means of the film in a social realist clothing. This is important as it reveals what happens when British social realism hits the global scene. In traditional British social realist films, often when it is catered only to the British audience, it's shown what is exactly on the tin: violence. For this new wave of British cinema entering the American market, Lexi Alexander made it so that it was sellable internationally. It is a nitty-gritty film, but even though, through its violence, it shows an excitement that draws in the audience. Let's look at how the film portrays its violence. Like, each fight is built into multiple sequences of things that will happen that hypes us up. Sort of like we're watching a heist through red lasers. There's the visual planning and visual roller coaster up until the climax where it progresses the plot. These fights within the film are never meaningless, while in real life they were always meaningless. This is genre of techniques that is taken from Western films. I guess you could call it the quote-unquote big fight. At the end, it literally mirrors the structure of a Western showdown. Two firms meeting up in one final battle to shatter the tension that harassed our characters throughout the film. This is what we would refer to as the violence paradox. This is where people get portrayed violence confused with romanticization. I mean, violence in films like Green Street must be shown in a way that is legible. And if it isn't, then pointless and illegible violence in a film is just a snuff film, to be blunt. Lexi Alexander showed the audience why hooliganism is bad, and he showed it for what it is. Once it's through a cinematic lens, it's watchable, because we aren't going to watch a simple fight shown from one angle. Once we hit the climax by the end of the film, we have Matt. He's covered in blood, victorious but not quite happy. He lives on for Pete as a transformed man. The film is really serious about the consequences of the film. I wouldn't even say Green Street had a necessarily good ending. Many lives were ruined, and only Matt came out without a scratch because he was simply a tourist. Just like us, the audience. We are tourists to this dreary film. We, alongside Matt, learned our lesson because we were always meant to just stay for a little while, but everyone else had always been doomed to an unhappy ending. This makes Green Street more historically significant, though. Coming out in 2005, the panic of hood culture and violence were now being expressed in film more regularly, and it caused concern for the youth. The 2000s saw this cycle of violence in film being accused for romanticization over and over again. But Green Street Hooligans had it both ways. It was a cautionary tale, but also an adrenaline rush. So, what is Green Street Hooligans? It's a film about the violence of sports hooliganism, friendship, and loyalty. But it's also a product of its era, a British-American production of the working-class British masculinity where it takes a social realist language to fully authenticate the movie-watching experience. It engages the audience to a very specific culture and history of British culture, something that is very much a look at the past, but it's entertaining and it's international. Green Street Hooligans is a great film that encapsulates the story of British cinema of the 2000s. It doesn't just depict football hooliganism, but it also sells it. That is what influences the genre being worth something to watch.